Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today we have a busy econ show, so we're gonna break it up into our normal 5 pieces, but we're gonna adjust it a little bit. In segment 1, we're gonna bring back the Three Gorges Dam because I don't know if you've seen all of the highlights, the videos about flooding within China, within Europe. We're gonna talk about some of the floods. We're going to then tie that into what do we expect for grains, crops in general. And then we're going to go through what's happening within Iran and it's just an example of a place that you actually have water shortages and a lot of problems that's happening in Iran. And that's just an example of how some of these things are going to play out. And then from there, we're going to go into a bit more detail on the global supply chain, where some of those delays are, how that's impacting tech. And then in segment 2, we're going to go deeper into U.S. wages, into home prices, how the home activity is starting to slow, but we're still seeing some increases in pricing in some areas, some starting to cut where their listings are. Then after that, we're going to go a bit deeper into U.S. rates. We've had a lot of changes in U.S. rates. We've had a lot of changes in the dollar, where things are shifting around, and what that is going to do to inflation, some of those inflation drivers and retail sales. Then we're going to look at India and the global supply chain, global deliveries, and a bit about Europe. It's a little bit light on the European front, so we're going to do a segment on just India and global supply chains. And then in the last segment, we're going to talk through China and a lot of those debt problems that have come up with some of the shifts in the way that they're allocating funds internally, which I think is an important backdrop that I would like to go through in more detail because I think it's important. So now just going through and touching on the Three Gorges Dam. So for those that remember, we did 2 big shows on the Three Gorges. They actually got our most views ever, so clearly it's a hot topic. This is looking at what is happening within the water levels in general. So before we get to flood season, because it does flood in China, they know this, just like there is monsoon seasons in India, they know this. They prepare for the increase in water levels. So typically it'll come down to about 145 meters. And then because the peak is 175. So it'll come down to about 145, which we saw July 1st. But you can see that it has quickly ratcheted up to about 150 to 151 meters. The issue is now the inflow rate is accelerating, and it's going to outdo the outflow rate, which is going to be the problem. So we expect to see a big spike in the water levels on the upstream side. Now, there's been 3 very large floods that have resulted in 3 failures of dams, with the Jiangsu provincial capital and major iPhone production center, interesting to see, 617 millimeters of rain fell from late Saturday to late Tuesday. That almost equals the city's average annual rainfall of 641 millimeters in just 3 days. So they got annual rainfall in 3 days' time. I don't know if you saw the terrible videos of people who drowned in the subway cars, but this is where we're seeing some very just massive problems in this part of the world. And we'll talk about why this is going to become a much bigger problem. First, we just want to look at, what is the Three Gorges Dam? So this is not like the Three Gorges Dam setup is going to be impacted by some of these upstream issues coming downstream. So Yangtze River, so when it looks like at this point, 175 meters is really kind of the maximum that can be seen on the dry season side. 185 meters is the maximum height. So when you think about the maximum height, you don't want to get to the max. You want to make sure that it's below that, which is why you have these sluice gates, which is just, they open it up and they increase the flow through the dam to avoid pressure on the reservoir side. So these are some of those different shifts that we've seen. And on the Yellow River, 75 miles upstream from the Jiangsu, where that was holding back roughly 12.65 billion meters of water, the total size of the Three Gorges. was the one that collapsed. So this is where we're continuing to see some of these problems, and Three Gorges Dam is coming back into the news because there's obviously a huge shift. And that's when we start looking at what is happening upstream. So when we look at the Three Gorges reservoir, here you can see the big shift in inflows taking us above about 150 meters of water level. And you can see just how quickly that has reached. And you can see the acceleration, which is going to move us up to 155, 160, which you're continuing to see this walk up. Now, the reason why we know this is going to walk up is just by looking at upstream levels. Here you can see that big increase that is going to be coming downstream behind the Three Gorges Dam. So this is why there's a big concern. People's Liberation Army warns the Yehetan Dam in the center of China could collapse at any time after being severely damaged in torrential storms. So it's just additional capacity that is coming under pressure because we're seeing some failures due to this insane amount of water that is dumping within a very short period of time. There's been sinkholes that have opened up. There have been just a significant amount of problems that are impacting some very key hectares and growing parts of China, which is going to impact not only soybean, but also corn yields. So now let's look at this in a bit more detail. So when we look at Jilin, Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang, have all been experiencing intense flooding with many thousands of hectares of crops wiped out. So when we look at it, essentially the number 1, 2, and 3, and number 7 output levels for corn are just getting absolutely demolished with rain. So you have a significant amount of flooding waters. Now, this is a problem because, one, there's only so much saturation that a root system in the soil can handle. And as you get this saturation, then the crops actually start to die. For anyone who's actually overwatered plants, you're getting an idea of what could possibly happen. It also increases the chance of rot, where you don't want your plants to be submerged, unless they're obviously meant to be, which becomes a huge problem for some of the largest areas. Now, this is looking at corn production in 2019 to show, because 2020 was its own problem. So we wanted to look at what happened in 2019, which was a fairly stable, normal growing season, to see what was the corn production in that period. And you can see where some of those issues are and how you're seeing these crops get washed away. Now, 2 dams in northern China collapsed. The waters of the corresponding reservoirs are now flooding nearby towns, which we've seen a bunch of videos on within the specific regions. Now, corn is just one side of it, but when we look at the shift, there's very little. When you look at Heilongjiang, Inner Mongolia, Sichuan, Henan, Jilin, all of these are still huge acreages for beans. So not only are we going to have corn issues, but we're also going to have bean problems when you think about how China's been buying. Now, they've continued to buy, they continue to be in the market, but they were expecting to see a nice recovery and bounce in corn yields, in bean yields, and this is just going to, I don't mean to make light of it, but this is going to wash away a lot of these opportunities that they thought they were going to have when you look at yields and what these crops were going to come up with. Now, if we look at U.S. corn conditions, because a lot of the swing production or swing buying coming from China is less from Latin America and more from the U.S. because they have very specific and very continuous purchasing that they do on a regular basis from LatAm. So when we look at U.S. corn conditions, you can see that net corn conditions remain fairly stable. Some places have gotten worse, some places have gotten better. This is going to adjust based on some of the droughts that we continue to see. And as we talked about in the EIA show segment 2, there's that heat that continues to push from the Northwest and the Pacific further across the country towards the East Coast. Now, the problem that we are seeing is on spring wheat conditions. So spring wheat conditions continue to get worse. So when we look at good to excellent, it goes from 22 to 16 in a lot of these areas. So you can see the decline in the percent that is good to excellent, and percent that is poor or very poor is kind of balancing between. So you're essentially seeing a pressure on wheat output. So not only are we going to see a problem with corn, but it remains to be some of these additional problems when we look at spring wheat. And then when we look at winter wheat, we're seeing this continuous problem coming out of the U.S. So there was a hope that, not to say that it was going to be a bumper crop, because it really wasn't, but we were going to see some strength, some opportunity coming out of this. And instead, we're just seeing additional pain and additional problems that are arising. And the reason why is, now I wish I could do this quickly and you could see, some of the quick adjustments between one and the other. But when we look at July 6th, you can see that there is a significant amount of drought that is pretty much the northern part of the U.S. and most of the West. But then when we look and go into July 13th, you can see that the red spots have increased, especially in the north, and you're starting to see some abnormally dry weather pushing south. And just based on some of the near-term capacity and near-term levels of topsoil moisture and some of these issues, you can see that it's continuing to push south. So the drought monitor continues to get worse, which is just going to put pressure on U.S. grains, especially as it goes into those breadbasket states and moves further to the east, away from Iowa and further south into some other areas. Because as you can see, Iowa also gets worse in terms of some of the availability as some of the moisture becomes a much bigger problem. Now, we just wanted to touch on Iran for a second, because Iran is seeing another bout of protests that have been clamped down on. There's been several deaths in terms of the IRGC utilizing live ammunition to try to break up some of these protests. Now, the Awaz on the western part of the country, which is right near, which borders Iraq, and is actually where a lot of the oil is located. So it's actually one of the resource richest places in the world. And yet these individuals who are Arab, now remember, Iranian is mostly Persian, so they're the Arab subset. And if you look, Arabs in Iran make up only 2%, where Persians make up about 61%. So these individuals live in squalor. A lot of their this money is funneled back into the regime, the IRGC. So not only are they in poverty and struggling, but they're also experiencing a massive water shortage. And it's not just, it just so happens to be this subset, but it is actually provincial wide. There are 2 provinces that this is spanning across, and they've had food shortages, water shortages, which have created protests. And instead of the Iranian regime showing up with water, they show up with military equipment and personnel, because they're meeting these protests with force instead of just showing up with water to address these problems. Some of the protests are saying that they're selling the water to Iraq, which is, I don't want to say unlikely, but it's probably not happening, because it's just there's a significant drought in this region, which is creating some of these problems. And the issue is a lot of this crude gets sold through Iraq, through Basra, into the Persian Gulf and out into the rest of the country. And Iran just brought online the Gulf of Oman, or so they say, the Gulf of Oman pipeline, to get around some of this choke point. They're expected to load one of their first cargoes. It's still unlikely that happens, but that's just something that is also being done to try to de-bottleneck. But again, there's more anger towards the regime that is only continuing to grow. And to give you an idea of where, so just to give you an idea of where these areas are, and a lot of the Arab populace within Iran lives on this oil patch that is right next to Iraq, and you can see how it bleeds all the way over into the Kuwaiti side and into the Iraqi side, which is why there's several shared fields that go between Iran and Iraq. So the people in Loristan province of Iran have started protests against the Islamic regime. They're chanting Arab and Bakaturari are united. They also chant, God bless your soul, in support of people in Khuzestan who are protesting water shortages. Now, Tehran has picked up that they're also protesting to show their solidarity with Khuzestan and the issues that continue to get carried out. Now, while all of this is happening, the Israeli military carried out more strikes on the Quds Force, the IRGC's Quds Force, and the Syrian Arab Army in the Aleppo airport and Al-Safira, in terms of just striking, again, like as we keep saying, they're just striking at will. Israel has just been pounding Syrian assets, Iranian assets within the Syrian country. And this is where the Iranian regime is under pressure. So the question is, when do they sign the deal with the U.S. and the EU to lift sanctions? Because all of these things are just putting more and more pressure on their underlying economy, as we've discussed, on inflation, on economic deterioration, what is happening in general. The question is, if the money comes back, will it show up for the people? Because we know in the previous cycle, it did not. And this is where that strife is coming in between the local populace and the regime. And that's where we continue to see those problems. So this is just giving you an idea. This is a provincial backdrop. So in Khuzestan is where we've seen all of those issues, which have then spread into Loristan and Elam. So this whole piece that borders Iraq has seen a big increase in pressure. Now, what have we also seen? We've seen military arms get passed from Iraq into Khuzestan, which is now creating additional problems because infantry fighting vehicles have moved into Loristan and Khuzestan because the IRGC has claimed that they have stopped military equipment and arms going between Iraq and Iran through this location. They're using this as an excuse to deploy more troops and battle tanks. But to be honest, it's highly likely that there are this movement of arms, which points to the holes in the borders in general and how there's a bigger drive of just additional pressures. Now, if we look against Pakistan, if you remember, Sistan and Balochistan have seen their own riots, their own protests, their own rise against the IRGC, and it's happening at the fringes. And this is what we've been talking about because Tehran has the least control of the fringes, with Sistan actually being semi-autonomous. So this is creating this additional pressure that is now essentially bleeding inwards, and they're losing control of the borders. And as people face food shortages, water shortages, this is only going to increase, and we're going to see these pressures mount. Iran is just one key example of where these things are arising. So now when we look at Vietnam and some of the other issues that have cropped back up because of COVID, this is looking at the Vung Tau port and how things have essentially moved to a crawl. So the situation is rapidly deteriorating logistically within Vietnam, as the southern region is under full COVID-19 lockdown. All marine terminals at Ho Chi Minh City, the main South Vietnamese gateway, are congested with many vessels waiting to berth. And then when we look at what the issues are, this is a primary global gateway hub for feeder vessels carrying cargoes to and from Saigon and against essentially within Vietnam. Important transshipment hub for smaller Southeast Asian ports to access global shipping routes, and it relieves capacity constraints on larger regional ports. So here's where we're continuing to see problems. They're bleeding into Vietnam, and this is leading to some of the additional problems that we're seeing on the global supply chain and how those prices remain elevated. Now, while they remain elevated, they're stopping their constant rise, but they're not falling. And this is because while some things are getting a little bit better, some things are getting a little bit worse. And this is where we continue to get this adjustment where as one thing gets better, the other gets worse. And it's some of the areas now that are seeing the problems are smaller, where the big places are starting to adjust and get a little bit less crowded and congested, and that was really driving that relentless bid up. But because of the shortfalls in other areas, the smaller regions, it won't drive prices higher, but it'll keep them elevated given the shortages that are created because of it, given the problems that still arise. And this is all coming at the same time as bottlenecks at the West Coast ports still remain, and they're surging higher. We're actually getting another shift up in terms of just a renewed push, which is why key ports within the West Coast are actually going to see a record amount of TEUs moving through them, because typically this is a low point, on a seasonal level, and then you get this push that starts in July and then accelerates through the end of the year for the holiday season. And instead of coming and starting from a low level, we're starting from these elevated levels and are going to see this huge push. All the while, global supply delivery times rankings for June continue to worsen. So when we look at just where these issues are, you can see it's across the world. And India is the one that is actually going to get a little bit worse. Same with Myanmar, but China has alleviated a bit. Malaysia's getting worse. And when you just look at where the other problems are on the developed market side, they're not getting better, but they're also not getting worse. So that's a small, caveat that is a benefit and is starting to keep prices from continuously climbing higher, but instead starting to flatline. But then when we look at the supplier delivery times based on sector, here you can see that technology and equipment, machinery and equipment, industrial goods, all of these things are still 30 days out in terms of just where the problems arise, where the issues are, which again leads to that additional chip shortage. And now when we look at China and a lot of these areas for the iPhone, Apple manufacturing, there's going to be a continuous issue just when you look at floods in some areas, droughts in others, impacting a lot of these movements on a global sector level, which is why when we consider the semiconductor global market share of demand, where is the demand? Well, the demand is in mainland China. So the supply is coming from America and other Asia, but demand is in China. So when you look at the demand side and how some of these shifts are going to have, you can say, well, demand is going to come down, which is true, but you're going to have then additional shortfalls on further down the supply chain, which is going to exacerbate the underlying issues and is going to keep us from catching up and is going to bleed this and push this into a 2022 problem as well. So then when we look at this on a global level, supplier delivery times for global tech equipment manufacturing, technology equipment, so here you can see just the slower delivery levels, all manufacturing, everything is just getting pulled lower, and it just, based on what we're seeing, it's going to stop getting worse, but it's not getting any better. And that's where we're starting to see some of this flatlining and some of these pressure points that remain. But on the good side, when we look at U.S. search activity for intermediate goods and the supply chain subside, so you're starting to see it falling out of the news. People are starting to price this in. This is becoming more normal. The question is, as these floods continue to arise, we expect some of this to come back up based on the issues that continue to plague the system, and is going to create more shortfalls on the tech side, which is going to drive some of this, some of the activity, some of the searches, and how people are going to address these shortfalls. And when we look at just the quarterly mega round deals, even though we've had this glut, these problems, these issues, we continue to see a lot of investment on, or I should say, these mega investments, these LBOs on a global level, with the U.S. really driving, I should say U.S. and Europe really driving this global number higher. And it just leads to some additional problems, because if you remember when we peaked LBOs, it was in 2007. And if you think about what preceded that, it's going to be a very tough time, especially when you think of rates being so low, money being so cheap, all of this liquidity, all of these levels, all of this leverage being used. It's going to lead to a bigger and bigger problem, which is going to be something to watch as we pivot into the next segment. That's going to look at what are some of the U.S. GDP backdrops, what are some of the hindrances to growth, and where are wages? Like, are people benefiting from all these dollars getting dumped into the market? And right now, the short answer is no, but we'll go through that in more detail in the next segment.